California in the 1970s was a land of opportunity, sunny skies, and expanding dreams. However, beneath this apparent serenity, an invisible presence infiltrated suburban communities. Fear began to spread as a wave of home invasions swept through small towns, leaving traces of terror and uncertainty. In 1976, the first attack attributed to the criminal known as the East Area Rapist was recorded. A woman woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a window being forced open. Within seconds, she found herself immobilized by a masked man. He tied her up, threatened her life, and committed the crime. This brutal attack would be only the first in a series of events that would haunt the region for decades. The attacker's tactics were precise and meticulous. He studied his victims' habits before striking. Anonymous phone calls, footprints near windows, and rearranged furniture to facilitate entry were some of the clues left behind. Fear escalated as more cases emerged, revealing a macabre pattern: calculated invasions, psychological control, and skillful escapes. As months passed, the press began reporting on the crimes, and the public became obsessed with the mystery surrounding the attacker. The police formed a special task force to handle the assaults, but concrete leads were scarce. Although DNA was starting to be studied in forensic science, it was far from being a decisive tool. Instead, investigators relied on psychological profiles and vague descriptions. At that time, the criminal's trail seemed undetectable. Panic settled in California, but few knew that this shadow was only beginning its reign of terror. As panic spread across communities, the criminal continued to operate with chilling coldness. Detectives observed a clear pattern: he targeted middle-class neighborhoods, entering homes through unlocked windows or doors. Often, he studied his victims' routines for days before making his move. The invasions were planned down to the smallest detail. The attacker disconnected phones, cut electrical lines, and carried ropes or duct tape to restrain his victims. He left no clear traces but took pleasure in emotionally tormenting his prey, whispering threats and demanding total submission. Investigations soon revealed that he wasn't just a burglar or rapist, he was a calculated manipulator. Many victims reported that he spent hours inside their homes, rummaging through belongings and eating, as if he felt safe and invincible. Despite increased patrols and awareness campaigns, the attacks continued. The press dubbed the assailant the East Area Rapist, and, later, the Golden State Killer, as his violence escalated to brutal murders. The lack of concrete evidence and the criminal's ability to escape frustrated authorities. Witnesses described a masked man, but details were vague and inconsistent. Investigations stalled while the predator remained invisible, leaving a trail of fear and mystery. As months turned into years, the Golden State Killer's trail of terror seemed endless. His invasions grew even more violent and disturbing. Survivors reported not just physical assaults but also elaborate psychological games. He thrived on fear, prolonging attacks and whispering unsettling threats while maintaining absolute control over the situation. The pattern began to change. Initially focused on rapes and home invasions, the criminal started committing brutal murders. The escalation in violence further shocked the public and put authorities on high alert. Investigators became convinced they were dealing with a sadistic and meticulous killer whose pleasure was directly tied to his victims' prolonged suffering. As the number of deaths increased, police resources were expanded. Specialized units joined the hunt, but the criminal always seemed one step ahead. Reports of anonymous phone calls, made days after the attacks, intensified the atmosphere of fear. He appeared to feed off the terror he caused, returning to crime scenes or calling victims just to remind them of the trauma. While physical evidence was scarce, forensic technology was still in its infancy. Without advanced DNA analysis, investigators relied on traditional techniques. But even so, the Golden State Killer continued to evade capture, leaving a legacy of horror and despair that seemed impossible to stop. Detectives continued scouring crime scenes for any clue that might expose the killer's identity. Fragments of rope, partial footprints, and bloodstains were collected and catalogued, but progress was frustratingly slow. Without advanced forensic technology, physical evidence failed to provide conclusive answers. As cases piled up, the investigation became an endless puzzle. Detectives analyzed patterns and connections, but the criminal was skilled at erasing his tracks. He wore gloves to avoid fingerprints and carefully selected victims to minimize witnesses. In some scenes, however, investigators found semen samples. These traces would prove crucial years later, but at the time, they served only as reminders of how limited science still was. The samples were stored in the hope that future advancements would offer new avenues for analysis. Meanwhile, public pressure mounted. The media demanded answers, and the police faced constant scrutiny. Wanted posters were plastered across California, but the Golden State Killer remained invisible. He seemed to know the investigators' moves, always staying one step ahead. The case appeared to stall, but detectives held on to hope. They knew that somewhere, there was a key piece, a clue hidden among the invisible trails. As the years passed, the attacks ended as abruptly as they began. The absence of new crimes provided temporary relief but also left a void of answers. Detectives kept revisiting files, searching for overlooked patterns or clues. Despite their efforts, the evidence led nowhere. The case was filed as unsolved, but the fear and memory of the crimes lingered. Many victims and families still sought justice. Detectives refused to give up, knowing the criminal might be living in plain sight. Frustration grew, but hope persisted that new technologies could provide the answers they sought. While victims tried to move on, the pain remained. Entire communities were scarred by years of terror, and the case became a constant reminder of domestic security's fragility. TV programs, books, and reports kept public interest alive, reigniting pressure on authorities to reopen investigations. Even with exhausted resources, small technological advancements began breathing new life into the case. Psychological profiles improved, and forensic techniques evolved. Investigators clung to boxes of files, hoping for an unexpected breakthrough. Yet, each year without answers made resolution harder. Still, those working the case held on to the belief that, one day, the truth would come to light. The Golden State Killer might have vanished, but his legacy of fear endured. For authorities, the search for justice was far from over. In the 1990s, forensic science began to evolve rapidly. New DNA analysis methods emerged, enabling investigators to compare biological samples with profiles stored in databases. This advancement reignited hope for solving cold cases. With the creation of databases like CODIS, old samples could be reanalyzed. These technological tools gave detectives a new path to follow. What once seemed impossible was now within reach, connecting past evidence with future technologies. Investigators revisited archived cases, testing preserved samples using modern methods. It was a time-consuming process, but discoveries began to surface. Fingerprints and DNA, once useless, became key pieces of evidence. In the case of the Golden State Killer, semen samples collected at crime scenes were retested. For the first time, partial matches emerged, pointing to possible relatives of the suspect. This breakthrough paved the way for new investigative strategies, including the use of genetic genealogy. At the same time, public genealogy databases began to grow, creating an unexpected resource for detectives. By using genetic profiles, they constructed family trees that brought them closer to the suspect. This advancement, while promising, also raised legal and ethical challenges. The collection and use of genetic information sparked debates, but the pursuit of justice continued to drive investigators. With each discovery, the net around the criminal began to tighten. Finally, after years of frustrating attempts, clues began to converge. The technology that once seemed like science fiction now offered concrete answers, and the hunt for the Golden State Killer was closer to its end than ever before. Genetic genealogy emerged as a revolutionary investigative tool, combining scientific advancements with detailed family trees. Investigators used public DNA databases to locate distant relatives of the criminal. This method drastically reduced the number of suspects. The analysis started with samples collected at crime scenes. These samples were uploaded into genealogy databases and cross-referenced with publicly available genetic information. Investigators found partial matches, leading them to distant relatives of the suspect. Piece by piece, this process created a family tree that gradually pointed to a single name. The investigation, however, required meticulous work and months of analysis. Each genetic match had to be verified, confirmed, and cross-referenced with historical records and census data. It was like assembling a puzzle, with each piece revealing a new detail. Gradually, the circle tightened. The genetic profile matched a man named Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer with a military background and knowledge of investigative tactics. The discovery was shocking but also brought relief to victims and their families. To confirm DeAngelo's identity, detectives needed definitive proof. They collected a discarded DNA sample from him and tested it in the lab. The results were undeniable: he was the Golden State Killer. This breakthrough marked a turning point in criminal investigations. For the first time, genetic genealogy was used to identify a serial criminal, setting a precedent for solving cold cases worldwide. DeAngelo's arrest, decades after his crimes, was a triumph of technology and persistence. But for the victims, the resolution of the case was only the beginning of a new chapter of healing and closure. The name Joseph James DeAngelo quickly dominated headlines following his 2018 arrest. For over 40 years, he had lived as an ordinary man, hiding a past of terror and violence. A former police officer and Navy veteran, DeAngelo appeared to be the epitome of stability, a married man with children and a respectable job. But behind this facade, he carried the horrors of one of the largest criminal cases in U.S. history. The revelation shocked neighbors and acquaintances, who described him as reserved and meticulous. Few could imagine that the quiet man in their neighborhood was, in fact, the Golden State Killer. Details about his life began to emerge. DeAngelo had expertise in surveillance and investigative techniques, acquired during his time as a police officer. These skills allowed him to outsmart authorities and avoid capture for decades. However, his professional background also raised suspicions that he had used police resources to plan his crimes. Investigators began piecing together his history. They discovered he had been fired from the police force in the 1970s for theft, an event that coincided with the start of the attacks. This information shed new light on his behavior and motivations. DeAngelo was also described by colleagues and family members as controlling and explosive. Reports of outbursts of anger and an obsession with order and discipline aligned with the psychological profile created by investigators years earlier. With his arrest, the pursuit of justice began. Victims finally had the chance to face him, and the courtroom became the stage for closing a cycle of terror. Although DeAngelo pleaded guilty, the impact of his crimes left deep and irreparable scars. Revealing the name behind the monster provided answers but also exposed the vulnerabilities of a system that took decades to catch him. Nevertheless, even delayed justice offered victims and their families an opportunity to move forward. In April 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested at his home in a quiet California suburb. After decades of searching, investigators finally had irrefutable evidence linking him to the heinous crimes. News of the arrest brought relief to surviving victims and their families, who had been waiting for justice since the 1970s. When DeAngelo appeared in court for the first time, the public saw an aging and seemingly frail man. However, the detailed accounts of his crimes left no doubt about the monstrosity of his actions. He was formally charged with 13 murders and multiple sexual assaults, though investigations suggested the number of victims could be much higher. The trial drew international attention. Court sessions were marked by emotional testimonies from survivors and victims' families. Many described the lasting trauma caused by the crimes, while others expressed relief at finally seeing the perpetrator face justice. To avoid a lengthy trial, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to all charges in June 2020. This confession provided legal closure but also raised new questions about how he had managed to evade capture for so long. Joseph James DeAngelo was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Although he avoided the death penalty, he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. The trial marked the end of an era of fear and uncertainty. For many, it was a crucial step toward healing, but the emotional scars left by his actions will be remembered for generations. The arrest and conviction of Joseph James DeAngelo brought long-awaited justice to victims and their families. After decades of uncertainty, the case's resolution provided answers but also reopened painful memories of a traumatic past. For many, the sentence represented more than legal closure, it validated years of suffering. The courtroom became a space where victims could share their stories. Their voices were finally heard, breaking the weight of silence. While no punishment could undo the horrors experienced, DeAngelo's conviction brought a collective sense of relief. The justice system, despite its flaws and delays, proved capable of solving even the most complex cases. The Golden State Killer case also highlighted the role of technology in solving cold cases. Genetic genealogy opened new doors for investigations, leading to the capture of previously unreachable criminals. This method became a model for how modern science can deliver justice, even decades later. On the other hand, the trial raised questions about the psychological impacts left behind. Many victims still struggle with trauma and persistent fears, underscoring that justice cannot erase emotional scars. Support programs and therapy have become essential for helping survivors rebuild their lives. DeAngelo's case continues to resonate. It symbolizes the resilience of victims, the advancements in forensic science, and the unwavering determination of investigators. Though delayed, this justice proved that time does not erase crimes, and that the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds a way to emerge.